All right, Damon or Jeanette, any opening words of welcome?
I think everyone has heard from us enough. We do appreciate people taking the time to jump on today. We're glad that we can go a little bit more in depth. Thank you to Jeanette and John for putting things together. And I will actually turn it back over to Jeanette or John, whichever person is next.
Okay, thanks, Damon. Welcome, everyone. And John's our fearless leader today, so I'm turning it over to you, John.
All right. Great. Well, let's dive in. I think everybody probably knows me at this point, but just in case we haven't had the chance to meet, my name is John McKay. I'm part of the BLH Mathematica team supporting the TANF learning community, and I'm going to be walking us through some guidance on moving from the innovation phase to the improve phase. And maybe asking, well, what does that even mean? Hopefully by the end of today's session, that will be clear. We've talked about these concepts before in some of our group settings, but I know that with everything going on, it's helpful to revisit them and also kind of bring some of them forward at the time when you are beginning to think about the last 5 to 6 months of this TANF learning community and how you might best use that time to move your initiatives forward. So, objectives for today are twofold. One, I want you to walk away with a pretty clear understanding of the purpose of the improve phase, right? We've been using this learn, innovate, improve model to frame our work throughout the entire TANF learning community. And so want to be really clear about what the improve phase offers in terms of moving your work forward and how it can benefit the work that you're doing. The second thing is I want you to walk away with some action items, and that could be planning, it could be brainstorming, or even just beginning to think about, but something clear and concrete that you walk out of today's session with that can help frame up the next 6 months, right? As I mentioned, we're sort of coming into this last phase of the learning community, and our hope is that you're in a position at some point over these next 6 months to implement a piece and formatively test that piece of your TLC initiative. So this graphic should look pretty familiar, and we know that everybody's at a different place in their transformation process. But regardless of when you started and how you started, it probably involved the learn phase, right? Why are we making a change? What's our vision for making this change? And how do we need to prepare our environment to facilitate this change? Those are some key questions that need to be answered before you're ready to start thinking about, okay, what is our solution? That, of course, is what you do in the innovate phase, which many teams have been focused on in recent months. What is the change? Let's define it, right? We had a proposal that identified some things we wanted to do, and then we worked with our coach and we interacted in these group settings and we refined our ideas. Maybe they evolved, maybe agency or political priorities shifted. But in that innovate phase, we want to be really clear about what is it? What are those core components of what we're trying to change? And separately, what are our strategies to make the change happen? We talked about that in last month's collective session. How do we shift mindsets and behaviors? Specific strategies are needed there, and we shouldn't overly rely on training and education to achieve these changes. How do we shift culture? How do we shift processes and organizational infrastructure? How do we shift mindsets and build skills and behaviors? Both of those are important to define in the innovate phase, and those set up the foundation for you to be able to move into the improve phase and start testing and refining based on the goals that you have. Another piece that should look really familiar is the roadmap for change, right? We've had some sessions on this. I know many of the coaches have been working with you all on developing a roadmap for change, but I revisit it here because it's really important for being able to do the improve phase work. Your roadmap is the guide for how you're going to test and improve whatever it is that you're implementing. And so unless you have that sort of guidepost for identifying here's what it is, here's how it works, here's how we're trying to change mindsets, behaviors, and skill sets, then your improve phase work will feel a little scattered and maybe unstructured. Importantly, when you start the improve phase, there is a temptation to kind of go right to that box on the right-hand side, the outcomes, right? We're eager to understand, well, are we achieving success? Are we measuring and finding that we've been effective in the change that we've implemented? But I want to encourage you all, as I've said before, to set that aside at first. Because one of the big pitfalls of implementing change in programs like TANF, like Workforce, are that we jump too quickly to kind of creating a proof of concept and trying to demonstrate that we've achieved outcomes, and we skip over the important work of figuring out implementation. And so in the improve phase, when you're starting out with some of that early phase testing of implementation, we're saying, okay, we have the outcomes in mind. We've done the work of linking our solution to the outcomes that we expect to see. But before we start to try to measure those, we really need to look at these first three boxes. What's going on there? What's the relationship and the interaction between our solution, the components of our change, the factors that are going to help and hinder the implementation of that change, and the strategies that we're using to bring about the change? That should be the focus of your improve phase work to begin with. And if we skip over that, right, then we're looking at effectiveness without really understanding whether our implementation is happening as intended. And that could be a waste of time. That's where I've seen a lot of pilots go awry and things don't pan out in the way that they're expected, but people say, no, let's not move forward because we didn't see success. Well, the lack of success could have been due to poor implementation. In fact, it often is. And so this is an opportunity to get implementation right. How are we changing? And do we need to change differently? So that when we get to measuring the outcomes, short, medium, or long term, we have a higher degree of confidence in the fact that we're doing what we intend to do. And therefore, our logic would say we expect to see that measurable result. So the sort of prerequisites, right? Thinking about your 101 before you get to your 201 in the improve phase are that you've actually done that work to confirm your environment's readiness for change. Do the conditions necessary for this change to happen exist? Be really clear and honest with yourselves about that. There is no shame and nothing wrong with hitting pause and kind of coming back to say, well, we've come up with this new case management model. We've figured out a new framework for using our data. We're ready to implement this new practice around supervision, but something's coming up over here that we didn't quite expect, and it's distracting what we're trying to change. It might be that there's an environmental readiness issue that you want to pause and address before you move into implementation. Second thing is make sure that you haven't skipped over that roadmap piece. It can easily be this sort of, or you can look at it as a performative task, right? Let's just kind of go through the process. My coach is asking me to do it. Everybody's saying it's important to map all of this out, but it really anchors the work that you're going to do in testing and implementing. The more detailed you define your change, the more information that gives you to assess the change, right? Because if you just say, well, our solution is to implement a new case management model that involves some coaching practices, involves maybe virtual and in-person interactions, and referrals to service providers in the community. Okay, well, that's pretty high level. What specifically should people be doing? How do you define a coaching practice in your program? What are your case managers going to do in their interactions at intake and at assessment and ongoing sort of goal development and progress? If you get into that granular level of defining your change, then you have a lot more information to then, as you start to implement it, look and see, okay, are we doing what we said we would do? And so whether you use the exact roadmap for change template or not, that's really neither here nor there, although I think it's really helpful. You can create a logic model, a theory of change, or some different tool, a process map, so long as you're getting to that level of specificity in what people should do and how they should do it, because you're going to need that information to develop your improve phase test. So this is the stop sign. Don't roll through it, right? Make sure you come to a complete stop and check both of these pieces before you start to pilot something. And I should say, if any questions are coming up, please don't hesitate to chime in or throw them in the chat. And I'll try to get to those before we move into team time. All right, so if any of you have seen a throwback movie called The Patriot, this might make more sense. If not, hopefully it'll still make sense. There's a portion in that movie where Benjamin Martin, the main character, is instructing his young son on marksmanship. And he says to him, you got to aim small and then you'll miss small. And the point of that is, right, that if you're aiming for a whole tree, not that you would try to shoot a tree, but if you were, that if you aim for the tree, right, you're either going to hit the tree or miss the tree. But if you aim for a piece of bark that's discolored, right, then if you miss that piece of bark, you're much more likely to hit the next piece of bark and still hit the tree. If you're aiming for a portion of the target, right, and you hit somewhere else on the target, because you've aimed small, your missing is also small. And I think that the concept applies here in our work with piloting too, because what we can do in sort of miss in piloting is that we think about whatever the change is sort of this big strategy, right? We've got a new case management approach. We've got a new way of serving our clients. We've got a new way of delivering employment and training services. But unless we get into this really nitty-gritty details of that and say, well, here's exactly what we're changing and here's exactly what that should look like and how people should be doing it, then we're not really going to be able to understand and unpack how that's going and whether we hit it or missed it. And so as you develop your implementation and your testing plans, think of it not just as this proof of concept for a coaching and case management model, not as a way of justifying to your commissioners or to your assistant secretary that this is worthwhile pursuing. Think of it as a way to get better at your aim. Think of it as a way to get better at implementing. And so precision is key. You've got to figure out exactly what you're aiming for so that you can assess how they're working and why they're working that way. That then leads you to be able to speak to where you need to improve. And if you're operating in this broadest possible sense and looking at outcomes, that's not going to give you a lot of information about how you can improve. You got to get into people's behaviors, the processes that they're using on a day-to-day basis to understand what needs to change and get better. So the primary way that we want to do this in the improve phase is called a road test. A road test is your starting point because it says we're going to try this specific piece of our roadmap or of our initiative out on a small scale for a limited time. And so the process steps for doing that, as outlined on the screen, are to select a component from your roadmap, right? So it's not thinking about the entire change. It's thinking about, well, let's look just at the hybrid service delivery. Let's look just at the way that people do intake. Let's look at the way that supervisors are working with staff in their one-on-one meetings. So select a component because that gives you the precision to figure out a piece of your change. From there, you want to identify, well, what is it that we want to learn? Create a plan and a timeline for gathering feedback about that learning objective. You analyze and interpret the feedback. What are we hearing? What are we learning? How does that inform how we should do things differently? And then you make some decisions, improve the process, and potentially retest it. So let's walk through those steps a little bit because this is exactly how you could spend a month or two, sometime between now and December, of trying out a piece of your change initiative and getting some really helpful feedback to make it stronger. So step by step, it starts with the roadmap, as I said. If you don't have that, then you're sort of a ship at sea without a plan for where you're going. So let's just say that your roadmap is about a system-wide shift to a more motivation-driven practice as opposed to one that's compliance-oriented. And as a part of that change, there are 4 components. You're doing a couple of specific policy revisions. You're introducing a new intake assessment. You're training and having staff use a new coaching model. And you're introducing some new staff performance standards. Here's how we're going to hold you accountable and and assess the quality of the work that you're doing. All right, so we've got a roadmap. We've got 4 key components to our change. So then what we need to do for a road test is to select one component of that solution. We don't want to try to look at all 4 of those pieces because there's a lot there, at least not at once, right? You could think about doing 4 road tests, but here we're going to pick one. And so let's just say that we're going to start with the new staff performance standards, because that's a piece that for the team is really going to drive the rest of this change. Really doesn't matter what the policy says or how the intake assessment is redesigned or how the coaching model is used. Staff need to understand what's changing in terms of how they're held accountable. That's really going to help drive the engine of this mindset and behavioral shift in the organization. So let's start there. That's the component we want to road test. So then we need to think about, well, what is it that we want to learn about that? If we're going to roll this out, maybe there's a guidance document, maybe there's some ways that supervisors are going to interact with their staff differently. What is it that we want to know? These are your learning objectives. Really important. Don't move into a pilot without articulating what is it that we want to learn. And so that could be stated in the form of 1, 2, 3 questions, maybe up to 4, although I think when you get past 4, you're really trying to do too much. And so try to keep it concise and specific. These are going to be questions related to implementation, not what did we achieve necessarily, but how is it working? How are people using this? In what ways are they doing this? How are they experiencing it? And how might we need to change the use, the introduction, the guidance of this new staff performance standard? From there, you can move into developing your plan for actually testing it, right? You've got some key questions that you want to answer. Now we need a plan to gather feedback from your users that will help you answer those questions. And so let's just say in this particular case that we're going to have a select group of supervisors and staff use the new staff performance reports. That's a key feature of this new performance standard, is there's a new performance report that's used in those one-to-one interactions. There's also a client achievement survey where clients are being asked on a regular basis to provide input about what they're achieving and how their coaches are supporting them in that. There's biweekly one-on-ones between the supervisor and the staff, and there's team huddles. So these are all elements where we can gather feedback, right? We can ask staff about the performance reports that are being used and provided to them. We can look at the data that's coming in from the client achievement surveys. We can gather some feedback about how those biweekly one-on-ones between supervisors and staff are going. And we can also take advantage of those team huddles for the next 4 weeks to understand how people are experiencing this, what's working well and what's not. And so that might also allow us to think about, well, let's create some psychological safety and some anonymity for staff to provide direct feedback through a biweekly staff survey. Really short and sweet, 5 questions that get at the learning objectives that we just articulated. And maybe we'll do a virtual staff focus group at the end of our road test. So there's no right or wrong way to go about creating your testing plan, but it's really thinking about, well, what questions do we want to answer? And then what's the best way to get information from those users or the people affected by it to help answer those questions? Surveys are great. Virtual focus groups are great. Observations can be an effective tool. Just think about what's the best way to get the data and to get honest information about the things that are working well and the things that are not, especially that latter piece. From there, right, you actually carry out your plan. And typically a road test is going to range from about 4 to 8 weeks. This is not an extended period of time. You're trying something out on a small scale, giving people enough time to experience it and getting their rapid feedback. Because the goal is not to test the effectiveness of it, it's to test the implementation of it. So once you've completed that 4, 6, 8 week period, then it's time to analyze and interpret your feedback. So here we want to go back to the learning objectives. Okay, what are the 2 or 3 things we said we wanted to learn? And what answers does the feedback that we just gathered offer us? What are the gaps in our understanding, right? Because this is not a a sort of comprehensive full-scale research study, there's going to be gaps in what you learn. So it's important to name those. Well, we're seeing some complaints and some frustrations around this piece, but we really don't know what's happening over here. It's important to name that, and then maybe if you retest this component of your plan, you go back and dig deeper on that. So asking yourself, what answers does the feedback offer? Where are the gaps? And where might we need to make some changes based on what we're seeing here? I think it's important to do this step collectively, right? Not just a couple of performance analysts and your management team, but try to get a representative group of line staff, maybe of community partners and service vendors, your supervisors and your managers, of course, your performance analysts at the table as well, but get a diverse group of people that represents multiple perspectives and roles to do that analysis and interpretation step. Because that diversity will help you understand what's at play in the feedback rather than just sort of guessing among a more select group. What did they mean by this? I'm not sure what the line staff are talking about here. That then brings you back to your roadmap for change. We come full circle because that's your plan. That's your guidepost for how you're making things work. And so you consider the insights that you've gathered from the road test and you say, okay, well, how does that change our logic here? What do we need to change about either the components of our solution or our change strategies, how it is that we're bringing about the change in mindsets, behaviors, and skill sets? Because maybe what we saw was a lot of defensiveness among frontline staff in their interactions with supervisors. And so we need some different strategies there to maybe promote some safety, encourage staff, make them feel like this is not an attack on them, but really to put some of the accountability standards more within their control rather than in the control of the clients that they serve, and then holding them accountable for something they can't control. Right, so that's part of what's happening here is you're coming back and you're thinking about how does our logic change, if at all, based on what we're hearing. You might have also seen some new or unexpected influencers, those factors that help or hinder the change you're trying to make. And so you need to account for those. When you're looking at your road test feedback, what your customers are saying, what your staff are saying, what your supervisors are saying, this is a really critical opportunity to apply a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens too. Because I want to challenge you to think about for whom is this going to work and not just does it work, right? Think outside of the average, which is typically when you do a research study, when you do a pilot, you look at average data, right? You look at means. And instead, on this smaller scale, when you've got just a handful of people trying things out, you actually have the opportunity to dig into the outliers and say, well, these people over here are completely disengaged. These people over here are fully bought in and engaged. Then we got a handful of people in the middle. Well, what's going on with these folks out here? Under what circumstances do things appear to be working really well and we're getting positive feedback? And under what circumstances do they seem to be completely going awry? Why is that? Talk to those staff, talk to these staff, and understand, again, the circumstances and for whom. What are the characteristics of these people and their situations? Because that might help you dig into, okay, this is affecting our veteran staff in a completely different way than it is affecting our new staff. This is affecting staff in the North office differently than it's affecting staff downtown. Our rural offices are experiencing this differently than our suburban offices. People of color are experiencing this differently than people who identify as white. Those are the types of questions that you can dig into. And so consider all the different perspectives in your road test. Diverse identities and experiences may matter. Keep an eye on the disparities and the inequities that might exist currently in your program or in the feedback that you're hearing through the road test. And as I mentioned before, try to be inclusive of those both with and without power, formal authority in your program as you look at the data. One of the most effective strategies I've seen is programs bring in a participant to help analyze their road test data, because that participant has a unique perspective on the questions being asked that staff and managers may not. So the sense making and the decision making is a critical step here. You've got lots of data and feedback to unpack. Go back to your roadmap and anchor in that. Here's what we thought we would see. Include those diverse experiences and perspectives, get lots of people at the table, or at least a select group of people at the table that represents different vantage points, and embrace a conversation that's divergent, right? One person might say, well, here's what I think the data is saying. And another person might say, well, no, I don't think that's it at all. Here's my take on that from my perspective. So embrace that, right? Have a conversation where people are trying to make sense of it in different ways. But then the conversation should strive for consensus. What might this tell us? Well, it might tell us that managers are looking at this from a completely different angle than frontline staff are. And so there's just, we're not on the same page. So we have consensus about the fact that we're not on the same page. That's an important conclusion from the road test. The questions that you're trying to answer are, what do the data tell us about our implementation, and what should we revise or refine? That group can help you answer those questions and specifically link to the learning objectives that you created at the beginning of the test. And so then your next steps will depend on your findings. Do you need to retest that component, right? Try out the performance standards again after you make some revisions. Maybe you feel good about that. The implementation went relatively well, and so you want to move on to testing the next component, which might be the coaching model, right? You bring in the trainer, you set people up with the tools and the resources, and you have them start using the coaching model. That could be your second road test. Or maybe things just completely flounder and you see a need to step back and reconsider your course and direction, right? We tried this. We're seeing some really messy environmental issues get in the way. And so we're going to hit pause and think about, what do we need to do differently here? The road test is your opportunity to fail and to do it fast. It's also your opportunity to fail forward. What I mean by that is you're moving forward because you're learning something really important and critical about your change before it gets to that level of, oh my gosh, this is really creating a mess in our environment, but we've already scaled it across the team. The commissioner's going to be really upset, right? This is on a small scale, and so it gives you the opportunity for it to blow up, and you say, okay, let's pull the plug, let's revise, let's get this right. There's often not that safety in our program environments to fail, and a road test I've seen is one of the best strategies to create that space so that we can try innovative things, for them not to go as intended, and for us to tweak them and get them right. So just to sort of sum up kind of the process that I just described for you in a graphic, this is one way that it can play out, right? You start with that initial test where you've got a handful of managers working with a handful of staff using a component of your change, and they do that for 4 weeks. You come back together, you analyze the feedback, synthesize the learning themes, and make some improvements. And then you might move back into a retest. Again, small scale, a few managers working with their supervisees in a revised way. 4 weeks, you come back together, analyze the feedback. What have we learned? Make some additional improvements. Iterate and improve. That's the goal here. Create the space for us to learn and to get it right and to strengthen it before we move into looking at whether we've been effective or had the impact that we want to have. So with that, I want to stop talking, and we're going to move into some team time so that you have a chance with your coaches to kind of think about what I put on the table today. And I'm not asking you to kind of walk out of here with a road testing plan, but I do want you to consider what would need to happen for us, where we're at today, in order for us to be able to road test something between now and December. What components of our work might seem best suited for testing, and why? Why might we want to start with that? Or why might we want to start with this? And maybe if you have time, get to thinking about what 1 or 2 questions might you want to answer from a road test related to implementation. So before we move into the breakout rooms, does anybody have questions for me on what I've shared in the presentation?
That was a great presentation, John, and I enjoyed that. This is Venus.
Awesome. Thanks, Venus. All right, well, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Casey Gray, do you want to give instructions on the breakout?